I'm just going to introduce a little bit at the beginning before I pick up on anything else, which was just about, can I check with our timings, please, Mike? We can go for about 35, 40 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, there's no rush, mate.
Great. So I hope everybody can see that little presentation up there. And obviously, I kickstart by saying Heritage Assets Part 2. That's just a temptation to recognise there's a Part 1, so you better invite me back to the first one. And this is where Mike realises he hasn't really got something down for July and he's going to ask me later. And I'm going to have to follow up on an excellent presentation last month, so I've got my work cut out, haven't I? And just to add a little bit of extra spice and dimension to the back end of the presentation, I've got a little game that I'm going to be playing with some of you. Even if you're online, you'll be able to play along as well. I've got a little game of Name the Artifact. I've got some treasured artifacts across the table in front of me here, ones I've stolen off archaeological sites in the last few years. I'll be passing them around everybody in the room. We can look at them, we go through them, they're not delicate, they're not going to break. And at the end of the presentation, I'll share some little pictures, some little photos of these, and we can just open it up to everybody in the room to see if we can work out what I've brought along with me today. Another hello back to Gary. Hello, buddy. How are you, mate? Good to see you. So Gary and I actually are working on a project together in London, which was about a collapsing ceiling in a wonderful early 20th century, late 19th century pub. Which shows the diversity of the kind of projects that Cotswold Archaeology work on and I get myself involved with. But today, I'm going to be very much talking to you about the stuff we find under the ground, how we find it, what we do with it when it comes up, and how that all fits into the planning process. So in other words, what we do, why we do it, and how we do it. I'm not going to spend much time dwelling on the skills and capacities and experience of Cotswold Archaeology as a business, because I'm going to feed that through the presentation as we start talking about real life projects that I've been working on and my firm's worked on. But by way of a little introduction, I've been an archaeologist for over 30 years. I ran my first archaeological site when I was 16 years old. Yeah, I'm one of those. And then went off to university and got myself a degree in archaeology at Bournemouth University, which is a very good university for studying archaeology. It's very vocational. It teaches you how to be an archaeologist, not just about archaeology, which is probably why I'm still an archaeologist today. I spent a few years digging for the Museum of London after I graduated, working on fabulous projects in the City of London. There was a really property boom in the early noughties in London, so there was lots of very high-profile, large-scale development projects which had great opportunities to deal with archaeological remains. So I kept myself busy there before my extortionate wage demands and a very bad back pushed me into working for a large engineering consultancy, which some of you might have heard of, called Atkins.
We know them well.
Yeah, I worked for them for nearly a decade, actually, as an archaeologist and heritage consultant, mostly working on, splitting my time really two ways, working a lot for Highways England, Highways Agency as was back then, National Highways as is now, on large road schemes, mostly in the North East. We were building lots of motorway improvement schemes in the early noughties and throughout the noughties. And also working on conservation management plans, which is helping people who own historic properties and historic places look after them, understand them better, and look after them better. And that managed to get me around the world. I did some work in the Middle East as well. I left Atkins in 2010, so I've been at Cotswold Archaeology for about 15 years now. When I joined Cotswold Archaeology, we were one office, 50 staff, about £3.5 million turnover, mostly working in the southwest of England. Today, we're one of the largest archaeological companies in the world. We have a £40 million turnover and 400 staff. I've got 4 offices, one in Andover, one in Milton Keynes, one in Cirencester, one just outside Ipswich. And in effect, I have a 5th office at Sizewell. I have over 200 archaeologists on Sizewell today, working on the largest archaeological excavation in the world.
Wow.
Yeah, big deal, big project. The reason we've been involved in Sizewell for over 15 years is that the nuclear industry trusts us because we've been working at Hinkley for over 20 years. And when you know how to work on nuclear sites, that's a rare skill. So we placed ourselves in that particular little niche as being the trusted go-to archaeologists for nuclear type projects and those very complicated infrastructure projects. but specifically the size of project that is. Size well means that it has to be a company of our size. We're actually delivering that as a joint venture with another company called Oxford Archaeology. So if you ever see branding out there, it was often being described as OCA, which is Oxford and Cotswold Archaeology, doing the archaeology on that project. And I'd love to be able to come back with maybe a colleague and we can talk about all the wonderful findings we've had at Sizewell. But for now, I'm going to start with a brief introduction to heritage assets, which is the word we use to describe lots of different things that have historic and archaeological interest. And I'm just going to set that context before we go into talking about buried archaeology in particular. And if anybody's interested in this rather bizarre image, that is not AI, that is not Photoshop. And if you didn't know, Stonehenge was built in 1934. And there's the proof. I've also got a picture of the rest of it being built in 1955. I can show you that one as well. It's a reconstruction, everybody. They do tell you that now when you get to the visitor centre. They didn't used to in the old days. So there's a whole conversation about authenticity and integrity and the ship of Theseus and Trigger's broom. Our most treasured heritage asset isn't quite what it seems. But let's start going into, and I don't have many slides which are text like this. I've got mostly just pretty pictures, but I do want to provide a little bit of context to understand how and why we find ourselves dealing with buried archaeological remains within the context of development projects. So this is an extract from the NPPF, where it says heritage assets range from sites and buildings of local value to those of the highest significance, such as World Heritage Sites, which are internationally recognised. These assets are irreplaceable resource and should be conserved in a manner appropriate to their significance because of the contribution to the quality of life of existing and future generations. That's almost, if you like, the kind of government policy statement about why we want to look after these places and treat them with respect through the development process. So here we go, look how subtle and modest and local this is. This is a listed milestone. It's protected by an Act of Parliament, so it's a listed structure. London 14 miles, Woodford 5, Epping 1. If anybody can recognise my accent, it's because I grew up 1 mile from that milestone, and I used to race my mates on my bike because I was a kid to get to the milestone first before anybody caught up with me, and then we cycled off to Epping. And then we have a not listed, not protected pub on the edge of a conservation area in Derbyshire, a building of modest architectural interest, some genuinely powerful local interest, because this was where some rabble raisers set up a meeting in the 19th century before storming a local factory to break up the machinery because they were afraid that the Industrial Revolution was going to do them out of their business.
Saboteurs.
Indeed, they didn't throw their sabos in, but this was, again, something of real local interest. And I don't know what's just happened there, excuse me, it's flipping around all over the place. Oh, we've done it again, that's a bit weird. Sorry, I'm going to move on now. There we go. And then we have these very large heritage assets. This is Blenheim Palace, almost an artefact, a point in time. You can transport yourself back to when the first landscape gardeners created this place in this beautiful palace, a World Heritage Site recognised for its outstanding beauty and historical interest. Another large landscape style heritage asset here. This is an aerial view of the Iron Bridge Gorge and Iron Bridge itself in the foreground there. Another World Heritage Site recognised for its outstanding universal value. And again, another 1,000-year-old building, the Tower of London, the White Tower. Again, a listed building, scheduled monument, protected by these Acts of Parliament, and a World Heritage Site in its own right too. So again, just another couple of little texty slides here. Another extract from the National Planning Policy Framework, which dictates how and why we engage with heritage in the planning process. It says here, in determining applications, local planning authorities should require an applicant to describe the significance of heritage assets. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, the significance of heritage assets. The level of detail should be proportionate to the asset's importance and no more than is sufficient to understand the impacts. And again, we're going to come on to some of these things in a minute. As a minimum, we should go to the historic environment record, which is like a bibliography of all the interesting archaeological finds, and that's looked after by the local planning authorities. So there's historic environment records at all the different counties around the country. And again, another thing we're going to come on to now is where a site on which development is proposed has the potential to include assets of archaeological interest, local planning authorities should require a desk-based assessment and when necessary, a field evaluation. We're really going to drill down into what those things are and the kind of projects that might trigger that work. Again, there's another couple of themes that come out of the National Planning Policy Framework here that shape and dictate what we do. It says when considering the impact of a proposal, one should consider the weight that's given to the asset's conservation. And unsurprisingly, those that are the most important should be safeguarded. But sometimes you have to weigh up the potential loss of a heritage asset. That might be the loss of buried archaeological remains because construction has to go ahead, or maybe the change or demolition of a historic building against the potential public benefits that might come from that. And that's that planning balance weighing exercise that I'll just come on to again as we go through our projects. And the way in which we articulate heritage significance, the way we think about why something might be important and why we might have to do something about it. There's a lovely document that English Heritage, Historic England, now created about 15, 16 years ago called Conservation Principles. And this document set out a framework so we all had a shared grammar, we had a shared language, so we could all, in effect, talk the same way about these things. So because there was often arguments and conflicts about what are you saying is important is not quite the same way I'm saying it's important. So this hoped to shape the way in which heritage professionals and archaeologists talk about archaeology, talk about historic buildings, talk about historic landscapes, in a hope that we would kind of narrow the disagreements so that we're all talking the same language. That failed miserably. We still have massive arguments about what's important, but fundamentally we're nearly always talking about it the same way. And I'm just going to come across just the top one there, evidential value, because that's the one I'm going to hone into now, because evidential value is another way of talking about archaeological interest, the way in which a place could be explored and investigated so that we can get its story. So I'm going to give 2.5 real projects now, projects that I've worked on relatively recently. In fact, actually, for all intents and purposes, 2 of them are actually still live right now. And I'm just going to walk you through the kind of planning process and the way in which archaeologists like me might get engaged in a project, the kind of things we'll be doing, and how that helps us understand and shape projects as they go forward. So this is a lovely little plan that you can see. The red line is the red line boundary of a proposed new settlement, in effect a new town, in what was the old Harrogate borough, but is now North Yorkshire, following the unitary authority shifting the way they do their business. And in North Yorkshire Council, this site has been allocated, or is about to be, the local plan is going through its final examination stage at the moment, it's going to be allocated as, in effect, what was the old Harrogate's area, new settlements, where all the houses are going to be built. 4,000 houses are going to be built at this new settlement. It's a beautiful location, it's very sustainable, it's got a train station in the middle of it, it's pretty flat, there's relatively limited ecological or landscape constraints, and it's a really lovely location for a new town. 4,000 houses that are going to be developed, hopefully when planning permission gets allowed in the next few months or year or so, that are going to be built over a 25-year period. The little dots you can see there at the moment, I'll come back onto in a minute, but the green areas are conservation areas, so they're the parts of the old, interesting historic villages of Kirk Hammerton, the Hammerton with the church, Kirk being church, and Green Hammerton, a small little historic village just to the north as well. As a... Oh. Excuse me, I think you can see what I can see, which is the presentation just disappeared. I do have a plan B. I'm going to go on to the plan B because my laptop's just been kicked off the internet and I don't know why.
Oh, okay.
So I'm just going to go on to plan B as if we were all ready for it. Yeah, it's quite nice. The harder and harder I practice, the luckier and luckier I get. So,
Can everybody still see that?
not yet, I'm quite sorry. I'm just going to go on to the right slide and then everybody can join in at the right spot. It's the right one, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody see that now?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry about that. That was a bit curious.
Okay, well, if you're just listening, could you just mute yourself? Thanks.
One of the first things we do as part of a desk-based assessment, and that's what happened here. So the developer and promoter of this site instructed us to go out and do a desk-based assessment, and that helps us get an understanding of any previous archaeological discoveries in the area, any interesting archaeological sites that might be known in the wider area or on the site itself. And as part of that process, I'm going to be looking at the screen, that's going to distract me. As part of that process, so we go to the North Yorkshire Archive as well, and there'll be records in there about archaeological discoveries in the wider area. And as we start to develop an understanding of the potential for buried archaeological remains on the site, we start developing these interesting maps that help us model an understanding of the landscape through time. And some of these little green dots you see here relate to interesting discoveries from the medieval period, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute, and some other discoveries about that are recorded as well. As part of that desk-based assessment work, we also, and this is quite an interesting one, we also have a look at historic aerial photos, because we have aerial photos in the archives that are held down in Sweden, sometimes held at local archives as well, which can sometimes show really interesting crop marks or soil marks, because buried archaeological remains have a tendency of presenting different soil conditions, which can allow crops to grow at different rates. Because, for instance, if you've got a buried wall, there's less water in the ground, so the crop will grow slightly lower. And if you take a photo at just the right height, you can get a certain different shading from the way the different crops grow at different heights. And that can give us an understanding of buried archaeological remains by the way the crops grow throughout the summer. So we also have another way whereby actually after the crops have been cleared and you've got some bare earth, the same thing can happen where the ground dries differentially and you can get soil marks, which again can potentially show that we've got buried archaeological remains. And for those that can see on the screen and those in the room here, we've actually been able to map out these interesting lines that could represent interesting buried archaeological remains on the site. And I'm going to come on to those in a second. One of the other exercises we do is we go back to some of the old historic maps to see if that will help us understand more about the way in which the landscape has developed over the last few hundred years. Most maps in this country, good quality ones where you can add some relative confidence about that's a thing that depicts something that was probably there, kind of dates to, you get some really, really good ones in certain parts of the country from about the 17th century, but fundamentally it's not really until we get these nice estate maps, these county maps, and eventually maps produced from the tithe maps. So this would have been early 19th century, and these maps were created so that the churches could get a better understanding of who was working what lands, so that they could tax them. It's always about taxes at the end of the day, isn't it? And we can look at these maps, and sometimes these tithe maps have what are called tithe apportionments. So sometimes the land parcel, the field itself, has had an old name that goes back many centuries, and that can give us an understanding of buried archaeological remains as well. And then we move up into the slightly more recent period where we've got in this case, a late 19th century OS map, which we know has been surveyed very accurately and can give us an understanding of the way in which the landscape has changed over time. So it could well be that there are buildings depicted on some of these maps that aren't present today, and that can give us an understanding that there might be something interesting buried nearby. We go through what's called map regression. We work our way through all the different maps through history to get an understanding of the way in which the landscape's changed and what we might find. So we work our way through all of those potential desk-based sources to get an understanding, but that can only get us so far. Can only get us so far in understanding, just like you might think about the way in which a geotech report looks at the history of a site in recent time. It's not until you go out and break the ground you really know what's buried under. But just like geotechnical works, we can actually carry out some forms of geophysical surveys, which again allow us in a non-intrusive way, without breaking the ground, to be able to understand what might be buried beneath our feet. In this example here, this lady is carrying a piece of kit which is almost identical to a piece of kit which is stuck on the back of this little rig attached to a quad bike. And this is a magnetometer survey. So this is a survey which allows to pick up subtle variations in magnetic disturbance in the buried ground. And that can often come about through, in history, the ground being burnt, or some other disturbance which has shifted the soil beneath our feet. And that, again, as I said, is an indication that there could have been something interesting happening there over time. In this particular example, this is our site up in Yorkshire near Harrogate again. We can see these grey plots on this figure. Ignore the pink areas. The pink areas where the farmers didn't allow me to go on and do my survey work. But the grey areas, I'm going back to do those pink ones in a few weeks, but these grey areas here were surveys that were undertaken a couple of years ago, and in the most part, they didn't reveal anything of great interest. They showed these streaky lines you might be able to see in the middle, and those in the room might be able to just pick them up there, but those can see where it says about area 8. In the middle there, we've got some lines of what were former agricultural ridge and furrow. So back in the medieval period, one of the ways in which we were trying to make the most out of our land, we have these inversions of ridges and furrows through the landscape, and some of you might see them around in the landscape today. And they have all been ploughed out flat, but there's still an impression of those former furrows buried beneath the ground, and the geophysics has picked up on that. But what was of particular interest was up in the northwest corner of this site, where the geophysics picked up some patterns that didn't match the existing fieldscape, the existing field boundaries, but were very reminiscent of something that I recognise as an archaeologist as the remains of a 2,200-year-old settlement that we had previously not known about. So we call that the Iron Age, just before the Romans joined us. So just before the turn of the second from last millennium. So it's about 300 years BC. There it is in a little bit more abstract context. These plans are called grayscale, and they're the ones that, it's almost like the raw data has been pulled out and they've been turned into these interpretation plots, and it helps us read these differences in the buried soils. And what we're looking at here is a series of small paddocks or enclosures. The dark areas are ditches, in effect, around a garden, and within some of these paddocks and areas and enclosures, in this little hexagon-shaped one that's just in the middle of your shot there for those online and in the room, you can probably just make out a tiny little circle as well. You can see my cursor, there it is there, and that's the remains of an Iron Age roundhouse. That would have been the ditch that went on the outside of a large thatched roof round building, and that ditch is actually where the rainwater would run off the thatched roof and create an impression in the ground. And this, as I said, was a previously unknown site, and it only came to light because of the proposal to take forward an application on this site and allocate this site for housing, and the work we did to inform that application. And as you look closer, you can actually make out there's some more settlement and more. I'm just going to go bring my cursor over on the left-hand side. There's another little circle in there as well, and that's the remains of another Iron Age roundhouse. Now, I was quite confidently being able to ascribe, based on the morphology and the shapes that come out of that geophysics, that was probably an Iron Age settlement. But we're going to have to have a closer look at it. And what we see here And this rather curious image, those long linear lines are about 50 metres long and about 1.8 metres wide, because that's the exact width of a ditching bucket on a 21-tonne excavator. And these are trial trenches. And we excavate trial trenches all to inform the planning application and have a better understanding of the heritage significance of these buried remains. Remember, we're going back to that language we saw in the NPPF. And in the NPPF, where it says local planning authorities require an applicant, that's us in this case, working with the developer, to do a field evaluation. First part of that field evaluation was the geophys. The second part of the field evaluation are these trial trenches. Now, these trial trenches are not detailed archaeological excavations. They very much this very small strip, as you can see there, just the width of a bucket. We've gone down through the plough soil, which in this case looks like about 400 mil, maybe 450 mil, and we've taken off that plough soil, which is all of the area that's disturbed by the plough every season, and we get down onto the undisturbed natural substrate, and within that substrate we can see the dark marks of the in-field remains of ditches and pits and features that were created thousands of years ago. And here's one of the products that will come from that trial trenching work. This is an extract from a trial trenching report, which shows the different profiles of some of those features we discovered on site. And in this case, we recognise that one of those ditches that formed the outside, the garden fence almost, of this settlement area had been re-excavated several times. So we can get an understanding that people were living there for many generations and maintaining and looking after their properties. So that is a rural example, and this is most definitely not. This is the urban version, but the same processes that I've just described about a large-scale development being taken forward and an understanding of the buried archaeological remains to be required. Now, I'll allow anyone in the room or anybody else to shout. Apart from the fact it says Bold Birmingham on the graffiti on the top of the building, you might be able to just make out that that in Selfridges up there in the top, and St Martin's Church there, if anybody, and the Bullring Shopping Centre wrapping around the left, if anybody knows Birmingham very well. This is all due south of that, and this is the Smithfield development, which is a £1 billion redevelopment site for 3,000 residential properties and other mixed use as well. There's going to be a new market built there, several public open squares as well. It's one of the most impressive redevelopment schemes in Europe, and this was granted planning permission a few weeks ago. But in the same way as I described for that rural site, we use those same tools, those same tricks to see if we can get a better understanding of potential interest in buried archaeological remains. And I'm just going to actually just flip back real quickly to that other slide, just to give you a flavour of what it looks like. So this site has some buildings still intact upon it, and in that middle area there where you can see the hard stand and that big concrete slab, that is the base of what was the old flower markets in Birmingham that were pulled down about 4 years ago, but were built in the 1970s. But fundamentally, the 1,300 acres, of this Birmingham redevelopment site, the Smithfield site, is basically under concrete and tarmac in its entirety. But we're cutting below that surface with our research. And one of those early historic maps that I made reference to earlier is a lovely one, which was produced in about, I think this is the late 1700s, this one. And this picks out something really interesting. In the lower corner here, we can see the ancient seat of the Lord of Birmingham. And in effect, a little moat that goes round it, and he's got his fine properties held behind that moat. This is smack bang in the middle of our site, and directly underneath that concrete slab I showed you just then. We can quite confidently geo-reference this map and work out roughly where that fits in the landscape. Well, St Martin's Church, I just showed you that, so we know where that is, and then we can work out what we might be finding underneath the concrete slab. And there we go. That's us superimposing the red line of the development site and realising, well, we're pretty confident that the Birmingham moated site is right in the middle of our site and somewhere underneath that concrete slab. So, just like those trial trenches I showed you in that rural example, the best way to have an understanding of what might be preserved in an urban context is to break that concrete and have a look. So we did that with a square pit in the top corner there. To give you a bit of scale, that's about 5 metres by about 3 metres. And then these 2/2.5 linear trenches, which we opened up to see if we could find if there are any buried archaeological remains beneath that concrete slab. And this concrete slab is about, well, is still there now, in places about 4 foot thick. They used all of the rebar. They just said, we'll have all of the rebar, please. And it's an incredibly extraordinary piece of engineering. It's perfectly flat, it's beautiful, it's quite a thing. And a bit like Jaws, we're going to need a bigger cutter. We broke through 3 different cutters just trying to get through the hard standing and the concrete to get down to the archaeology beneath. But that we did. On the left-hand side there is a photo from the 1970s. When they were building the flower market, they pulled down the old Victorian markets that had been there for 100 or so years. And as they were building new base plates for the 1970s flower market, they found the remains of the old manor house. That's a black and white picture on the left. And back then, they didn't have the same legislative or policy practice to look after archaeology and preserve it. In effect, it was all just rescued. You just had basically volunteers and other people from the council going down, doing what they could in and around the construction workers. And on the left-hand side, they were given quite a bit of time, to be fair, back in the late 70s, excuse me, given quite a bit of time to record and do research on the remains they found. And then they were told they were going to just bury up back around it, cover it up, pour the concrete on, and then build the new flower market. Now, that's what they said happened, but we didn't actually know that happened. We didn't see any photos or anything. So that's why we opened the trenches now. We opened the trenches to see if actually what was left, what they said was left. And there it is on the right. It was. It was exactly where they said they left it. And we knew exactly that because that little chip in the right-hand side there, which you can see on the sandstone base of a very fine 12th century building, is exactly the piece we found and was photographed in the 1970s. So we've got reasonable confidence from these little windows we opened up underneath the concrete that actually the remains of the 12th century manor house, the 800-year-old manor house, is preserved underneath this big concrete slab. Now, that's quite pretty. It has some architectural interest, but this is the first house of Birmingham. This is Richard de Birmingham's house. That gives me tingles thinking about it. Just think about it. This is where Birmingham was born. He applied for a license to open a market in the grounds outside to King John, outside his manor house. The market opened and the market is there today. It's been running for nearly 1,000 years and it was born out of the remains that still survive underneath this concrete slab. So not only can we learn more about the 12th, 13th, 14th century living and the way in which these people inhabited and occupied this part of Birmingham, but in this particular instance, these buried archaeological remains surviving beneath our feet have real historical resonance. They're there, they're under their feet, they're telling us this powerful story. So we worked with the engineers to find a way to ensure that they are still preserved in situ, underneath that concrete slab, and we worked with the different building foundation options, and the little curious image on the right-hand side shows the way in which we were trying to work out how the piles for the new market could be placed in a way so they didn't disturb the buried archaeological remains. And we kind of come up with a scheme that worked quite well. In this case, you can see we're kind of putting a new building that kind of sits slightly awkwardly across the top, but it was okay, it's going to work. And we threw that away and came up with a better idea. This is what it is. We've created a brand new moat place, a publicly accessible square that exactly matches and maps the line of the old moated house beneath. We're going to have interpretation facilities on site that tell the story, and those remains are going to be buried beneath the ground underneath that marketplace. It was quite an easy thing to do because the levels are quite complicated, so actually we didn't need to dig down too deep. We were able to build the market square in exactly the right location, height-wise and horizontally too. And here's an example of, in effect, a £1 billion project having at its heart buried archaeological remains, informing the way in which new design and new places are created. That genuinely still gives me tingles. I'm a man who's lived in the West Midlands for 25 years now, and I live in Worcester, but Birmingham is my second or third home maybe. And I'm really looking forward to taking this project forward. We are about 4 weeks away, 5 weeks away from going on site to do some further preparatory works. We've got lots of services running through some of these areas, so we're going to go and make sure to see where those services lie in relation to the buried archaeological remains, and we're going to work out how to do the detailed design for those in the room. I'm just going to point it out, but just underneath where it says markets there, where they're going to build the new markets, we're just going to finesse the detailed construction design for those piles to make sure that they don't go anywhere near the buried archaeological remains. During the process of developing this scheme, Historic England decided to schedule the remains. They weren't previously scheduled. They looked like they were there, or we thought they might be there underneath the concrete, but they are now protected by an Act of Parliament, which means I need to apply for a special licence if we do any works that could disturb them, including the works that come up in a few weeks. I have something which is called Scheduled Monument Consent, which is special consent which allows me to do those works. Now we're going to take it forward and bring it local to Cannington, because actually now those kind of the archaeological works I've described are all those investigations that lead up to making a planning application, to informing a design, to getting planning permission. In the case here with Hinckley, it didn't go through the traditional planning application route that the previous two schemes did. This was obviously a DCO, so rather than having a planning condition which dictates there's interesting archaeology on your site, you need to do something about it prior to construction, we have a requirement on our consent here, which meant that we had to do archaeological works in advance of construction. And in this case, a lot of really interesting archaeology is unearthed during specifically the construction of the bypass that runs behind Cannington, behind us here. And we found lots of really interesting Roman remains, including Roman buildings. We found some really interesting remains of a Roman settlement site. So we had corn dryers, we had other industrial processes, we had parts of the buildings they lived in as well. We had 100 archaeologists probably on site at one point, maybe more than that, maybe about 150 actually, working for over a year. As you can see, we literally follow behind the big digger as the big digger strips the construction site of the material. In many cases, we're dictating the way in which the excavator removes the soil, so we can go down onto the buried archaeological remains and record them and deal with them through that process. What then follows on from that is all of the research that goes on site, but we also then take a lot of those artifacts and eco-facts, which are tiny little remains of say, charred grain or insects and things like that, and they help us understand the way in which the landscape was being used, and maybe sometimes what people were eating thousands of years ago, and that helps to build a wonderful picture around the history of a place. And in this particular instance, it moved on to the production of some very detailed but accessible archaeological reports. We also did a lot of local exhibitions, we did local talks, and we shared these stories across the internet and our social media platforms as well. So fundamentally, it's all about understanding the likelihood of archaeological remains being encountered on a site, all of those tools and tricks we use to better understand those, helping developers take projects through that planning process, and then helping them deal with the conditions that follow afterwards. Cotswold Archaeology is a charity. We do not make profit. Our sole objective is to tell stories about the archaeological discoveries we find. That's what we do. That's why I'm here today talking to you. It might be about developing relationships and finding opportunities to work on projects like this and help you understand a little bit more about what we do. And how's that for timing? because I can check the time now, which says 1:45. Let's play a quick 5-minute game. I'm just going to share some things I've found on my travels. And I'm going to, for those online, I'm going to flick through some slightly better photos of the things that we have on the screen there. And I want you to just have a little look at those and pass them down and see if you can work out what they are. I'll give you a clue. So those 4 were all discovered together. All the other ones were discovered separately. As we pass them down, in fact, I'm just going to pinch some so we can pass them around and work our way around. So I'm just going to jump online and find the photos for everybody. I'm going to go back to these afterwards and explain to you what I found. So there's my, if anybody's interested, I don't use a mouse to describe scale. So you can see how big that is. There's my mouse. I'll come back to that one in a moment.
It's quite fine, though.
We've got these features as well, these little artifacts. And what we're going to do is I'm going to come back and see if any of you can throw out what they think they might be. Here comes the questions. What they're made of. Where I might have found them. I'm going to come back to what it might have been used for and when. So that's the second one. Here's the third one. Again, I'm going to come back into these in a minute. I'm just going to quickly flick through them here. There's another one. Here comes the last one. Yeah. So I'm going to start with that one. So if I'm going to start with that one, why not start at the beginning? The beginning is always a good place to start. So I'm going to go back to the very first one I found. So for those that are in the room or those that are online, does anybody know what that might be made from? What it might be, where I might have found it, and what it might have been used for? Flint. It is made of flint, yes.
Some form of scraping or cutting.
It is exactly that. It's a scraper. So it's a flint scraper.
Cleaning animal skins.
Oh, wait a minute. We got an archaeologist in the room because there's somebody here who's declared exactly what it is. So that there is a flint scraper. And now comes the tricky one. When and where?
Stone Age.
Stone Age, that's a great one. It's stone.
So Stone Age, when?
Not from.
So it's what's called a thumbnail scraper. And it's called a thumbnail scraper, which you can see there, because it's kind of the shape of a thumb. And for those that are in the room, when I hold it like that, you'll see that it kind of matches the way in which a thumb might scrape leather skins. So you can remove the material and use the skins and hides for making clothing. It's probably about 2,700 to 3,000 BC. So it's about 5,000 years old. These kind of artifacts, these kind of flint thumbnail scrapers are pretty much found all across northwestern Europe. This particular one was found when I was walking back from the pub in the Isle of Man about 25 years ago. But like I said, they're the kind of ones you might find anywhere across Britain. This one here, now, what are these made out of? I'll give you a clue. They're not too dissimilar from the first one. And what do you think they might be? Anybody online? Do you recognise what that might be and what it might have been used for, where it might have found it? So it is flint. Somebody's just recognised that. It's exactly the same material as that first.
Is it part of like what they call tesseract from the floor?
No, it had a very specific knife. No, so it's I'll give you a clue. It's not a knife, but it is a weapon, but just a tiny little bit of axe. Okay, I'll give you a bit of extra context now. I didn't find, a colleague of mine found not just these 4, but tens of thousands of them in an infilled pond near Portsmouth.
Fishing network.
Scaling fish.
No, the pyramids. No, not arrowheads. I'm now going to tell you they were probably manufactured in the late 19th century. It's getting weirder, isn't it? It's getting really weird. So when I said they were part of a weapon, that was a big clue. But this is abstract. And why this is abstract, and somebody just realised what it was, I just had a noise. Flintlock. They're flintlocks. They are the part of a gun, of a flintlock rifle or pistol, that allows the spark to be created that sets off the powder that shoots the musket. What's incredible about these is that I show these to archaeologists, and they have no idea what they are either. They are really odd, really abstract. Why was thousands of them found in a pond near Ipswich? Well, it transpires, I've never quite been able to prove this, but there's a bit of an urban myth that there was a little old man making these in the shed at the back of his shop along this part of the regenerated part of Portsmouth, long after flintlock guns were being used. And he just kept knocking them up as almost like a hobby of an evening and made thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of them, but had nobody to sell them to. And then when they redeveloped the area, they pulled his shed down and just dragged it into a pond before they built a new shopping centre. And that's why context is king sometimes, because finding one of those individually is rather abstract. Finding thousands of them together is really bizarre. But when you start bringing those things together, you get a better understanding of the story and a better understanding of what it might have been used for. So we're going to shift it over a little bit now and move around. So those in the, I'm going to ask those in the room to stay a bit silent on this one to see if anybody online might recognise what we're looking at there. Again, I've used my handy mouse as a bit of a key, but to give you a flavour, you know, that's obviously just a bit of something. Anybody online? Gary, come on, do you want to have a go? What do you reckon that might be, Gary? If it's still there, put you on the spot, just because I know you're my mate. Might have gone.
You're on mute, Gary. You have to unmute yourself.
Ah, there you go. He's still there. Well, I'll put undue pressure on you, Gary. That's fair enough. But anybody else in the room then might recognise what this is? So first of all, it's a piece of pot. Yeah, it's exactly right. It's a piece of pottery. It's obviously quite nicely glazed and there's a pattern on it. And this, yeah, it's got an animal on the left-hand side. It's a rather crude animal. But what that is, that's a piece of Roman pottery. So it's probably about, not quite 2,000 years old, maybe about 1850, 1900 years old. I can tell you exactly where it was made. It was made in a part of what's now central France, Gaul as it was. And it's known as Samian pottery. And it was a very well traded, very luxury piece of pottery. So only the people who had good money would be able to trade and have these, because they were taken over to Britain all the way from, as I said, all the way from central France. Actually, there were knockoff versions made of this just outside Colchester in Essex, as is always the case when there's a good trade. Somebody might be trying to make fake ones. And the little patternation you see on there is probably a rather crude dog or hare on the left-hand side. And you can just make out what looks like a smurf on the right, but there's a chap there, he might be a gladiator. So it's rather crudely made and it's slightly worn down, so some of the details were lost on it. But that would probably have been part of a quite large bowl. You might think of like a fruit bowl size. And moving quickly on again. What we might have it, oh sorry, by the way, where that was found, I think it was found on a site I was working on 25 years ago in the city of London near St Paul's and near the Bank of England. I was sat in a pub and one of the labourers I worked on site, and as he was walking off, I went, oh, sorry, Rob, I found that on site. And he just gave it to me in the pub out of his pocket. And I was like, okay. I don't know what to do with that now. And he went, well, you remember where you were digging somewhere over there? I was like, oh, okay, it'll join my collection of educational pieces. So it's two parts. There was two parts. My friend has the other half, and they join together. So we have something else here as well. Again, for those in the room, you've been able to feel it and get a hold of it. Any thoughts online or in the room what we might be dealing with here?
Oh, water jug, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's another piece of pottery. This is a part of what might be a kind of a vase or a pot. And this is called poppy head. because of the little effects that almost look like little poppy seeds. And the way that would be created is when the glaze is put on the pot, it would be pinpricked. And it creates that little effect that creates the poppy effect, the poppy seed effect that runs around the top. Again, quite a common feature of pottery from that era being exactly the same date as the sailing ware. Exactly the same date as that Roman piece of pottery, but that would have probably been made locally. And that one I found when I was a little kid riding my bike across a field in Harlow, in Essex. And lastly, very lastly, another one here. I'll give a clue to those online. It's slightly more delicate than the other two pieces of pottery we found. And it's got a nice little pattern on it. And again, it's just a little piece, a little chunk. And I wonder if anybody could throw up where that might have been found or what that might be. So yeah, it was probably again from a kind of a cup or a bowl. And I found that on a little pile of stone and other bits of broken pottery when I was working in Oman in the Middle East. I found it about 20 years ago. And I managed to speak to the potter who ran a shop just around the corner and said, do you know if this might be old? And he went, no way of knowing, we've made them the same way for hundreds of years. Because context is key. And in that instance, it could literally have been made in 1985. Or it could have been made in 1885, because he said his family's been using the same pattern for all that time. And there's nothing I can do about that, and there's nothing I can ever get any closer to being able to tell the story. But if I'd have found it with other things, in a different context, I might have been able to tell a different story. So there's just a bit of fun, a little game, and here I am to answer any questions you might have about any of the things I've just spoke about.
What was the most interesting thing you found at HPC?
So, to be honest with you, at Hinckley, I wasn't directly involved in a lot of the project work, so I'd love to come back and talk to you about maybe a two-part presentation, a little bit about Hinckley and a little bit about Cotswold. But it was probably what we found on Cannington with the Roman building. We found the remains of a hypocaust, which in other words is a very high status room within a fancy building with underground heating, a 2,000-year-old heating system. Yeah, quite a thing. More sophisticated than most of the heating we have in most of our properties today.
Was that under the direct line of the road?
It was, yeah.
Which bit?
Oh,
because I set it out later.
Yeah. Do you know, I can get back to you on that because, to be honest with you, even when I looked at the map just now, I was struggling to reorient myself around the bypass and around those bits of the road there. But on that example, that was entirely excavated and it was all removed. So it wasn't like the example I gave with Birmingham where it's been preserved in situ. That was excavated to allow for construction.
Okay.
Yeah. But if anybody says, what's the most interesting thing you've ever found, which does happen all the time. And actually, about 25 years ago, I was working on a construction site where we used to have people basically have a week's holiday working as archaeologists on our site. And we sat in the pub chatting to two people that used to work, did at the time, they were on their busmans, work in customs in Heathrow Airport. So they sat me down, and just before they asked me the question, what's the most interesting thing you ever found? I went, what's the most interesting thing you've ever found? They keep it clean. But on that site, I worked on in London, just between St Paul's, where I found that fancy bit of pottery, or the labourer did, between St Paul's and the bank. So Gary, if you're still online, then if you are not too far away from where we work on the Cross Keys, there was a large Roman townhouse. And there was a fire that burned down almost all of London, what we call the Hadrianic fire. And we know exactly when it happened, because basically, as archaeologists, as we're working our way through the layers, you come across a massive burnt area, and it covers all of London. So we can date and phase everything based on, oh, that's where the fire was. And then they built the new London on top of it. And as we came down onto that big red and black layer, I came down onto the mosaic floor of the fancy Roman townhouse, and the pantry of that fancy Roman townhouse had burnt slowly enough that the wooden shelves had burnt, and the pots and plates had stacked perfectly. So as I was excavating them, they were in perfect condition. We could have literally taken them up to the canteen and had our lunch on it. And in the room next door, on top of the beautiful mosaic floor, as we lifted the wall plaster of the walls that had collapsed in on themselves, we could still make out the painted ladies that had been drawn on the inside of the wall plaster as the walls had been collapsed. And so that was quite probably one of the most remarkable discoveries I was ever involved with.
Sorry, this is Mark. So can I just ask, I'm from Birmingham. I remember the flower market as a kid. I've been there recently building something incredible elsewhere, but in Birmingham, and often wondered what they were doing with it. Just as someone that really doesn't understand why we do what we do, why wouldn't you excavate what was there to show it to the public as something that I find incredible to be able to see? Why bury it?
So the Birmingham example is a really interesting case because there's two things we have to remind ourselves about archaeological excavations, is that they are wholly destructive. Yeah. So as I'm working my way through an understanding of the remains from the 16th century, that goes over my shoulder into a bucket for me to get down to the 14th century, which goes over the other shoulder for me to work my way down. So by the time I'm getting to the interesting story about the Romans or the interesting story about the Iron Age, I have excavated and removed all of the interesting medieval stuff. So fundamentally, archaeological excavations and investigations are destructive. Now, in the example of the remains of the medieval moated manor house, Richard de Birmingham's place, in that instance, it wasn't easy, so we could have excavated more, but at the same time, you kind of want to leave it behind. You kind of want to leave an impression of this really interesting part of our historical narrative of the city. So could we have, in the Birmingham example, found a way to show it off, to display it a bit better? Well, that would again also have been quite challenging, because not one, just because the difficulties in the heights and the way in which the different levels work across the site, but actually to care for it as well is a really difficult challenge, because if it's wholly accessible and completely open to the elements, you have to think what that might do. I mean, this is red sandstone from Birmingham, so you've got to take care about just rainwater on it deteriorating it. And obviously, if there's physical access allowed, you know, do you put up the big red velvet rope so that nobody can physically get into it? Do you have to take care about rubbish being left or kids messing about with it or breaking pieces off? So there's all those logistical challenges that go sometimes to the presentation of archaeological sites. Again, using the Birmingham one as an example, we felt the best way to showcase that isn't about leaving the few fragmented remains of the wall on show, or trying to find some way of interpreting and physically depicting the moat itself. So what we did is we have recreated it with that public open space. And that is one of the greatest challenges we ever come across as archaeologists, is trying to balance that line between what we can protect and leave in the ground and what we excavate for reasons to do with research and bettering our understanding. So it's a really good question, and it's one that we tackle every day on the really complex projects we worked on with the really interesting archaeological remains.
Anyone else online with a question for Rob?
What happens if the project can't afford it?
So for those that might not have heard that, the question was thrown in, what happens if the project can't afford it? So all of the kind of investigations which I explored through there are not only just getting information to inform the planning process and that planning balance, but a lot of that information allows you to actually work out what the capital costs are going to be to deal with maybe buried archaeological remains. So the example I gave of Yorkshire, where we've got this really interesting Iron Age site, I've worked with a developer to understand the likely costs for having to do a large-scale archaeological excavation in that piece of land. Now, that piece of land is probably going to be phase 3 or phase 4 of the development, which is going to come quite a bit further down the line, maybe 10 years from now. But they understand that that's a cost that they will have to incur. We do all of that to minimise risk of uncertainty. But still, sometimes you do find things that you're not expecting. And that's tough. A lot of developers will come to me and say, I don't want you to do too much work to inform the planning application. What's the absolute minimum, Rob, you can do so that I get planning permission? And I say, well, the absolute minimum I might do is I might not go out and do some trial trenches. I might see if I can get you planning permission just based on the results of the geophysics. But I tell you, that's moving the risk down the line. That's moving risk into construction, where you might not have time, and you might not have the resources. What I've said more than anything else in this game is there was these wonderful dancing ladies I found on plaster once, or that's a bit of Salienware. I say archaeologists are cheap, delays are expensive. Yeah? So pay for your archaeology up front, get a good understanding, manage that risk. When you're developing your construction programs, when you're developing your enabling works, speak to experienced archaeologists, work out where the archaeology might come in that program and get it done nice and early and out of the way so that we're not on site when you're trying to build a haul road. So we're not on site when you're trying to do some essential capital works that are somewhere on that critical pathway. Because there is inherent risk associated with archaeological discoveries, just like there are for any other ground contamination as well. You know, the better informed you are, the less risky that job might be. But the developer pays. The developer pays. I've got a really interesting project in Sutton, actually, where they had a relatively large land parcel. I think it was something like 60, 75 houses. All of the archaeology was at one end of the site, no archaeology at the rest of the site. He said, I'm just going to build the bit I can afford. I might come back and deal with the archaeology another bit at a later date. It's not sterilised, it's there, I know it's there. If house prices go up, the cost benefit analysis might work out better.
So you can't just leave it further outward.
There are examples of building around stuff. Yeah. In effect, you know, the Bournemouth example was kind of building around it. Yeah. I did a project on Anglesey in Holyhead, where we had exactly that, and there was quite an expensive excavation for what would have been an early medieval cemetery, and we just worked around the design and left it where it was and didn't excavate it. There was a substation we were going to build, which involved us actually taking a section off the little knoll. So in the end, we just reworked it, went with a retaining wall, so we didn't have to remove as much earth, managed to leave the archaeology in situ. It's a great example of us being able to save the archaeology, leave it where it is, tell a story about it. But fundamentally, I was sat in that meeting having a conversation about money and program. That drove it, and then the other things came along.
Any more questions for anyone?
Are you governed with how long you have for your dig by the construction companies?
Yeah, to a certain extent. But what will happen is that a construction company who's paying for me to be there, they'll say, we've got 3 months. Can you work your project into that 3-month period? And that might mean whether I have 15 archaeologists on site or 3. And, you know, there's a point where you can't squeeze 15 archaeologists into a small space. But broadly speaking, we work with our construction companies to manage a programme that works for them and just for them. Because just a reminder, it's their condition that they're trying to discharge. It's their requirement to deal with the archaeology. It's not mine. You know, I'm there to help deliver your projects. I'm not there to whack you with a stick. I'm not there to dictate how it goes. I'm there to develop something that you get value from, which doesn't impact your programme and allows you as developers to come forward and go, look at the great work we've done, look at the great stories we can tell.
So who discharges that it's actually done?
We do that in relation with the local planning authority's archaeological advisor.
Yeah.
So we'd work with them on the methodology and the approach we take to the dig, what we dig, what don't we dig, how much we dig, what questions we're trying to answer. Because we're not just going around digging everything. You know, a lot of things have been dug before, a lot of our questions have been answered. Every single site comes along with some specific research questions. So we say, what can we learn about this thing here? So we're not just going to dig everything, record everything, take photos of everything. We set ourselves these research questions and we come along to make sure when we're spending £10,000 of a small house builder's money, he knows what he's doing, he's contributing. Or if we're spending £1 million of a developer's money, that she's going to get bang for her buck. That it's just not another report that's going to sit on a shelf. But no, let's be honest with you, and this is going to come out in the news soon, the stuff we've found at Sizewell is unbelievable. It is completely changing the way we thought that whole part of east of Anglia was occupied. It's changing the way we thought about how people settled and lived 6,000 years ago. It's completely changing the way in which we understand the medieval landscape of the abbey and how they worked and swept that land to make as much money out of it as possible. You know, so these things are game changers when they're done well by professionals who ask the right questions and know how to get the answers out of the ground.
That's really exciting. Okay.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. You know where I am. You can look up Cotswold Archaeology online. My details are on there. As I said before, this is Heritage Assets Part 2. If anybody wants to hear Heritage Assets Part 1, that's more about historic buildings and some of the kind of projects that Gary and I work on sometimes when we're trying to find the best way to look after the historic interest of an old place.
Yeah, we'd love to hear that. That's great.
Thank you all.
Rob, thank you very much for coming. We're so privileged to have you here, and it's been so exciting listening to the stories, and also that your passion for the work has just come right through. So thank you very much for coming, and definitely look forward to seeing you again. And thank you very much for your show appreciation on what. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay, so if there's nothing else, John, shall we declare the meeting over?
We can do. I was just going to say, because we probably just tipped over the hour, so if you're happy, Mike, can we declare 2 hours of CPD for this evening?
Yeah, sure. Help yourself.
Yeah.
Help yourself.
That's excellent. I don't know if there's any other further comments or AOB for the nuclear chapter tonight, is there?
Not for me, mate.
John, will you be sending the certification out?
So I can send out the minutes to...
No, the CPD.
Yeah, well, it'll record on the minutes that we've got 2 hours of CPD, and we'll have your name on there, Victor, so it'll confirm that you've attended.
Thank you very much, John.
No problem.
Thanks to all our new guests for joining, and it's been such a treat listening to you all. Thank you for all coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invite.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Good night, all.
Good
Bye,
night.
guys.
See you later, Paul.